We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 94 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Dan Heaton and my partner in podcasting today is Mike Swaddling, the co-founder of the Croydon Constitutionalists. Mike, you been arrested yet?
No, I fortunately dodged that bullet so far, and I hope to continue that way. But genuinely, it is a concern that one doesn't necessarily know what you'll be arrested for. I don't believe I've really ever done anything that's slightly particularly illegal. It's a bit boring, but I am. And but now who knows what's the law tomorrow? I mean, I had previously thought you might get arrested for throwing concrete at politicians, but that's not really a terribly punishable crime anymore, it appears.
No, that appears to be a suspended sentence type of crime these days, but but there you go. There you go. Well, we are delighted to be joined today by the director of the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute, Sam Bidwell. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, both of you. Thanks. It's been great to be in touch over the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of fun putting the world to rights.
Oh, we've got a lot of work to do. There's no doubt about that. Well, Mike, I think you've got a few questions for our guest.
I do indeed. So yeah, Sam, thanks. Yeah, thanks for joining us. So obviously at the Adam Smith Institute and the director of the Next Generation Centre, can you tell us a bit about what the Next Generation Centre is and how that fits into the wider work of the Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I mean, I joined the ASI in February. I was working at that time for a Member of Parliament, and basically we recognised a need to address a gap in the market, right? Very, very ASI. Namely the fact that you look around and what you see amongst younger people, and when I say younger, I mean under 40 nowadays, you see a real scepticism of liberal ideas. You see in many cases an outright rejection of those ideas. And what I think often the problem can be is that those of us who are convinced of the ideas get really into talking to ourselves and talking to one another. And we've all got these great discussion groups and these great forums, and we all go to the pub together, and it's all wonderful, and we sit and we gripe and complain. But often we're very bad at evangelizing for ideas, whereas I think people more traditionally of the left are excellent at doing so. They have no problem at all of going around and making sure that their ideas are heard, whether or not people want to hear them. And the basic idea of the centre is that young people are disengaged, and in my view, potentially rightly so, with classically liberal ideas, with free market economics. They feel, and again, I think rightly so, that our current economic model hasn't delivered for them. Now, there are some perception problems there. So a lot of young people will say, well, the reason I can't get a house or start a family or get a decent job is capitalism, or it's market economics, or it's neoliberalism. And of course, what we know is we actually live in an extremely highly regulated economy. We've gone from 20 regulators thereabouts in 1997 to about 90 today. More of the economy is regulated than ever before. We live in a country in which our planning system, there is a level of absurdity in having this idea of economic planning anyway, but we have a planning system that protects vested interests at the expense of potential future homeowners. Again, that's not very neoliberal, that's not very capitalist. And we've got a government which protects vested economic interests, vested business interests over challengers. Again, not very neoliberal, not very capitalist, not very free market. So our kind of central pitch, put it on the back of a post-it note, is that market liberalism, classical liberalism, is not the economic system we've got. It's an alternative to the economic system we've got. And it's a much preferable alternative to more regulation, more taxation, more socialism, more restrictions, etc. The left has been very good at presenting that as an alternative to the status quo. We, I think, unfortunately, when I say we, I mean people of the centre right of the right of politics, have fallen into the trap of defending an imperfect status quo. And actually, we don't have to, because it's not what we want. This is not the system that if we were sitting down, we would design. And so what we can say is, well, it's great that young people have got all this frustration because so do we. Let's start presenting ourselves as a kind of insurgent, young, youthful alternative rather than feeling any kind of need to defend I don't know, landlords, right? Which, Smith has some pretty strict things to say about rent seeking. So very consistent with the ASI's core philosophy of market liberalism, etc. This has always been an institution which has been at the forefront of fighting for economic and political freedom in the UK. It was there in the late 70s when those ideas were needed more than ever. I think we're reaching a not dissimilar position now. And so the Next Generation Centre is kind of our attempt to recapture the youthful, potentially slightly irreverent mood of that time and to start reaching out to young people with classically liberal ideas. And actually, it's young people that will benefit from those ideas most.
I was very excited there briefly when you said young people included anyone under 40, then realised I was actually still a decade too late. But yeah, no, I get it these days. Obviously, people are often still stuck at home to a later age. They're not buying and all that stuff you say. So I guess it does go further. You've already touched upon this. It's not obvious that young people have a big belief in free markets and liberty, and you just said this yourself. So what do you think's causing that? What are the kind of critical things that are causing that failure to see how useful free markets are?
Sure. So I think there is a big perception problem. So whenever you look throughout history, who are the radicals? The radicals are downwardly mobile people. Generally, downwardly mobile middle-class people are the most anti-system people in any situation, right? It's people who feel that the current system isn't working for them. They want to smash it up, whatever. We are in a system now which is not delivering on the economic basics for young people, particularly for kind of aspirational, professional young people. So there's this implicit promise in British politics: you will be richer than your parents, or at least as rich as your parents. And this is held true for 5 or 6 generations in a row. Things have gradually improved over time. In the 20th century, things improved for a period quite rapidly. And I'm sure probably we align on the diagnosis of why things improved quite so quickly. But we're now in a situation where it's more expensive than ever to buy a home. Wages have stagnated since 2008. There are more barriers than ever to starting a family in economic terms. So that promise, that implicit Burkean promise of improvement generation to generation, has not held. Instead, what we've got is stagnation. In many cases, we're actually going backwards. Housing is a great example of that. And so people think, well, I've got no stake in this current system. This current system isn't delivering. So we've got to have a different system, right? And what I think classical liberals and the right in general have been bad at doing is pointing out, well, actually, hang on, we're not the establishment at this point either. We do not live in the halcyon days of the late 1980s anymore, where government was busily engaged in deregulating and removing responsibility from government. Since 1997, even though he was a more moderate figure than perhaps some on the Labour left, people like Tony Blair, people like Brown continued this, Cameron continued this. Frankly, almost all of the Conservative ministers of the last 14 years have carried this on. We've been busily engaged in the opposite of a deregulatory process. We're regulating more than ever. We are restricting economic freedom more than ever. We kind of freedom of association from a business perspective is completely shot. The planning system is completely broken, all of this kind of thing. So it's not as if we're living in this economically liberal utopia that we might be. Instead, we're living in a system that's very, very regulated. But we've been very bad at pointing out to young people that our ideas are actually an alternative to the status quo. They're not this terrible status quo which is failing to deliver. And as a result, they assume, well, this is capitalism, so capitalism's the problem, and we must instead have socialism, or at very least a kind of managed, mixed, high tax economy.
Indeed, it's funny. Housing does come down to so much. It's funny. I think there's an obvious case when people stop to think about it, about how much free markets improve so much of your life. I'm in a house with double glazing, central heating, a fitted kitchen, full of consumer products that I didn't have growing up, and no one had when I was a kid. Some of those things, but the big difference is, and of course, we all now walk around with a powerful computer in our pocket. Again, something that wasn't available not really that long ago. 15 years ago, smartphones didn't exist, I think. And you can make that sound, but of course, if you can never afford to move out of home, it's all a bit pointless, isn't it? And that's is such a devastating consequence to people.
Well, I think that's right, and I think our people don't often articulate it this way. The pattern of settlement in England for 800 years or longer has been relatively small family units, relatively high levels of economic mobility. You look at land records in Kent in 1300 or whatever, which is part of what I did for my degree, and you'll find that there are more transfers outside the family than within the family. If you look at a comparable place in Europe, in Germany or France, you find that it's familial transfers. People are much more rooted to where they grow up. They're much more rooted to the land. England in particular, Britain in general, has always had a kind of property owning, economically mobile, small family streak. And so much of our common cultural sense of maturity or of growth, personal growth, is rooted in that idea, right? You leave home at a reasonable age, you go out to work, you earn enough money, you get married, you settle down, you buy property, etc. All of these ideas are very, very old ideas, and there is something stunting in a kind of deeply emotive way about not being able to move out, not being able to stop renting. There's a kind of a dearth of freedom that comes with having to run, putting up wall hangings by a landlord. All of these things are more than they realize. And actually, I can give you some. I was talking to a friend who's doing a bit of research into this. I can give you some really worrying practical examples too. So we know, for example, that children who are raised in flats almost always uniformly have worse educational outcomes. Because of things like you don't have the green space to play in. You don't kind of develop the freedom that brings with it. There are very, very real as well as very, very emotional reasons that we kind of seek home ownership. And ultimately, as you say, regardless of all of these wonderful things, right, I'm sitting here with a kind of Nespresso coffee and I've got a smartphone next to me and I'm talking to you on a laptop. All of these things are kind of wondrous inventions to somebody 100 years ago. But at the end of the day, if I can't at some point in the next 5 or 10 years own my own house, I'm still not going to feel the economy is working for me.
No, indeed, and I'd add that. And I think we've moved much more to short-term tenancy as well. I do think a lot of my suspicion is there will always be a lot of people that rent in any economy for a variety of reasons. But again, that used to be a long-term tenancy basis, and that's moved, I believe, to broadly much more to a short-term tenancy basis. And of course, that just you lose your sense of permanence. They're houses, not homes. And that's most felt when you buy, but even when you rent, there is a distinction based on the type of renting you're doing. I think.
Well, you know that great phrase, "An Englishman's home is his castle," right? Everybody knows this kind of foundational phrase. It's actually from I think it's Peel. I believe it's Peel talking about renting. So what he's saying is that protections for English renters in the Victorian period were so strong that it was akin to a kind of private property style relationship. So as you're saying, right, like people used to have these highly protected long-term tenancies where you didn't have to ask your landlord if you wanted to put up a wall hanging. The basic expectation was you kept the place running and you didn't burn it down. And, if you needed to leave, it would be presentable for the next tenant. As you say, what we have now is a system of precarity, uncertainty, instability, people having to, there is basically an inability to put down roots in a short-term tenancy system. So I think you're absolutely right. There's more we can do for people taking the step between leaving home and getting their own home. There's a lot we can do there too.
So obviously not just 13th century house moving have you looked into. You've been talking recently about Hong Kong, Dubai, and Docklands. And indeed, we published your tweet threads on those, and thanks for that. And they're really good examples of free markets working and free markets working with good governance. And I think I was excited by them because we as an organisation talk about a lot of different things, but we don't see enough. We don't talk enough about how you can sell free markets and sell economic liberalism to people. And I think those were great examples of how you can do that. What other suggestions have you got for selling that economic liberty to people?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, I mean, I'm an empiricist by nature, so I like examples of where things have worked, and I find that's always the most effective. Always the most effective way of doing it, because you can talk to as many economists as you like. You can have the Laffer curve explained to you a million times. Nothing is as good as a real world example. So, part of the reason there is that people will always come back with competing theories. And what we know is that very clever, but in my view, wrong economists of the left will often come up with these kind of theoretical or hypothetical refutations of classical or Austrian economics. They'll say, well, look at this graph, it doesn't quite work this way, etc. But what we know is that when you give people more choice over their economic decision making, everybody in the aggregate ends up richer. And on an individual basis, people end up freer from obligation and freer from kind of, again, precarity, or all of these scary concepts. I particularly like Docklands as an example. I've been using that one a lot. And I think the reason that it works so well, and this, I suppose, would be my biggest point, is that it's a great narrative. The story is really good. It's not just an example of something working in practice. There's a tale to tell about pushing against the orthodoxy. It's quite punk. It's quite punk rock. It feels, maybe it doesn't feel so much that way now, but you said it the right way. It feels kind of exciting. This is a government that was doing something brand new against orthodox thinking, which had made the country very poor over a long period of time. And they've built something that's really cool and works and that you can touch with your hands. That, I think, is more compelling than, no disrespect to some of my colleagues who prefer this kind of line of argument, more philosophical points or more theoretical points. I think human beings are attracted to narrative. It's why it's why this whole capitalism is the root of all evil thing works so well, because people are looking at a world that isn't working and they go, well, there's a high level of unfairness, and people can't get houses, and there's a lot of stagnation around, and all this stuff. And that narrative offers a very straightforward response in the same way that concepts like structural racism offer a very clear, easy response to difficult problems. The right, in general, I think, is more resistant to narrative. It tends to think in terms of practicalities and difficult truths and all that kind of thing. But there are stories like Docklands, to some extent like Hong Kong, which allow us to build our own narratives and to say, look, this is actually what this can look like in practice.
No, that's interesting. It reminds me that how often you sort of find yourself speaking to people and they put a point of, I want this to stop, or I want this to change. And you make the point that it's never going to stop, it's never going to change completely. What you can do is make things better. And that's a nudge and an edge. And of course, it makes people glaze over somewhat. Docklands, great example. Old enough to just about remember not the end of the docks, but the wasteland of Docklands, and then the building of it. And I worked there about getting on for 15 years ago now. And every time I go back, there's another dozen big buildings, and it's amazing how they've kept regenerating. It didn't stop; it keeps going. It's something that you can see all the time there, which is fantastic. So that we talked about examples, but perhaps on a practical level, if you had your wish list, what would be a couple of key policies you'd introduce to restore younger adults' faith in free markets and liberty?
It's a great question. If we're living in the utopia, the first thing you do is repeal the Town and Country Planning Act, which is, in my view, an evil bit of legislation which is stopping thousands of homes being built a year, giving tens of thousands of people the dignity of home ownership and stability and the ability to get on the economic ladder and all that sort of thing. If I'm thinking more practically, and this is maybe a bit of an insight into some work that I've got coming up, I would love to see an ambitious government bring in a whole second fleet of development corporations a la Docklands. So I would love to see that whole Thames Gateway area from Greenwich all the way down to even into Kent and Essex, Southend and Dartford and all that, basically designated as an area where the planning system is going to be streamlined, and you do a similar area around all of our other big urban centres. I think that's a really good way to supercharge not just growth, because of course construction is great for growth, but home ownership, and get it right, and we can have the kind of ambitious developments that we pioneered in the 80s. I mean, people forget. This is also part of the problem, right? Is most people can't remember a world. Most people my age can't remember a world pre-Thatcher. And reading history makes you terribly unpopular. There were large areas of British cities that were just unlivable and unpleasant and crime-ridden, unclean, etc. That was totally transformed, and we now take these areas for granted. Salford Quays up in the north is a great example. There are others. Merseyside, maybe the best one. We could just do that again, right? There's no reason that type of policy, development corporations, wouldn't work again. So that's high on my list. I mean, public order is another one that I'm pretty big on. No society has ever, no economy has ever grown without a basic level of public order. You only got to look at someone like Lee Kuan Yew, who understood this. Even Cooperthwaite in Hong Kong understood this. There is a great value in making sure that at a basic level crime is punished, and that's super important for businesses in particular. I mean, look at the rate of shoplifting at the moment, and the lack of enforcement around shoplifting. There was some terrible Telegraph report that showed something like 98% of shoplifting cases go nowhere, right? There's a report that goes in, it goes nowhere. As a business, that just makes life impossible, right? So even if we're going to tax and regulate these businesses, which you may have picked up, that's not exactly what I would do in an ideal system. We can at least make sure that their property rights are protected and that they're basically safe.
It's not the shop in the nice part of town that has this problem. That's a good place to run a business that doesn't probably need another shop. I mean, I don't believe in needing these things. It's obviously market demand, but a shop where it's not that one that gets shoplifting. It's the person that's opening a shop in a marginal area where locals could do with more choice. They're the ones that get punished. They've already got a hard fight, and that's the nature of crime, isn't it? It always afflicts those that can least afford the problems worst.
Well, this is it. You're comfortable. You're comfortable people in, and I'm not to pick on anywhere, but you're kind of Richmonds and Wimbledons. They can buy their way out of crime effectively. They can get really good security. They can live in nice areas. They can put their kids into schools in lovely leafy boroughs of southwest London and Surrey and all these other types of places. It's people in areas that are, as you say, marginal, who suffer the most. It is the tyranny of criminality is just as real as any other type of tyranny. It is an absurd mental burden. It is an absurd practical, economic, fiscal burden, and it hits aspirational working people the hardest. It's a profoundly unjust thing to allow to happen. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, anarcho-tyranny.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is exactly it, right? So law-abiding people suffer increasingly stringent regulation from government, while at the same time government fails to police criminality. It's exactly the wrong way around, and unfortunately, that's so often it feels where we're going in Britain.
Yes, indeed. Well, where are we going? We've obviously just had an election, and we have a new government. So, with all of that being said, what are your thoughts on how they are doing and what we could perhaps expect from them?
Yeah, so I mean, there was a lot of enthusiasm initially out the gate from people in the sort of classically liberal think tank world. Uh, they looked at Labour's planning policy and they thought, well, that seems sufficiently ambitious. They seem in principle committed to growth and to liberalisation of the planning system and all of these different ideas. What has actually happened, I think, is that they've gotten into government and they've discovered that governing is really hard, and you actually have to annoy people sometimes, and not everything you do will be popular. So what we've seen is some relatively mealy-mouthed moves on planning. I've been impressed with some of the stuff that Rachel Rees has done. She fast-tracked approval for a couple of data centres, and a solar farm, I believe, in Suffolk. So there have been a couple of green shoots. On the whole, though, I look at people being imprisoned for speech offences, whilst people who commit violent or sexual crimes are being let out of prison by magistrates. I look at promises to introduce a whole raft of new regulators. I look at this absurd smoking ban thing that they're talking about. They've been speaking about that in the last 48 hours. Across the board, it doesn't look too good. And actually, I'll add to that, stopping new North Sea oil and gas licenses at a time when we desperately need cheap energy. Right? If you want to keep any industry going in this country, you've got to have cheap energy. Right? It's almost difficult for an economy to grow if it has to not grow if it has cheap energy. Right? It's the closest thing you've got to a silver bullet, and yet this government has said we're going to cut those licenses.
We have a financial black hole and a treasure in the ground, but we're not prepared to dig it up. I mean, how absurd.
Exactly. And I, if I think they've been dealt a really rough hand, I wouldn't, I think everybody can see that the situation they've been landed with is not a good one. And I agree when Keir Starmer says things are probably going to get better before they get worse, and we're going to have to make tough calls, right? I agree with that. But his prescriptions, in my view, are completely the opposite of what we need. What we need is somebody who gets the basics right and doesn't try to add more onto what government is already doing. It's better, always better, to do fewer things well than more things badly. And unfortunately, I think this is a government that will tend to do the latter.
Well, governing, of course, is about making choices, isn't it? And, within 5 minutes of getting in, they've given big pay rises to loads of public sector or near enough public sector workers. And in response to that, others are threatening to go on strike. So, governing's not that easy, is it, Mr. Starmer?
Well, this is it. And there's the great Rudyard Kipling poem, Dane Geld. If you pay the Dane Geld, you'll never get rid of the Dane. This is unfortunately what happens. Whenever Labour gets into government, it's always the unions that bring them down. Normally, they give themselves a few years before letting themselves get taken in. But it seems there is at least one sense in which this is a government committed to efficiency.
One achievement I found from them is for the first time since I gave up smoking many years ago, I regret giving it up, only insofar as if they're going to bring this ban in, I would deeply enjoy going down the pub and taking the law to the absolute limit every time I could. But it's not taking back up smoking is not a price worth paying to do that. But yeah, ludicrous set of events for them. Well, thanks for that. Been great to hear from you there.
Well, yeah, I mean, just one final thought there for you, Sam. I mean, obviously you've got some ideas about how we could do things better, but what are the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute? What plans have you got there to actually get young people, or younger people, I should perhaps say, engaged with these sort of issues?
Sure. So we produce research and we run events. So I will make a good habit of sharing the details of those with you guys. And if there's anybody in your network who might like to attend, then of course they're more than welcome to. I think in a very practical sense, part of what we're doing is we're finding wedge issues. So our most recent bit of research, there's another piece coming up, as I kind of alluded to earlier, on development corporations, but our most recent piece of research was on nightlife, this question of nightlife and, pints being expensive and pubs closing early and all of that. And what we've been able to do is we've actually been able to talk to a lot of young people and get them quite animated. But what we've been doing in doing that is pointing out that actually the cause of your high drinks prices and your early closing times is actually tax and regulation, right? It goes back to the same classically liberal talking points, tax and regulation. So, and when you get them on that, you get them thinking, and they start they look around, they start to recognize how much of the discomfort that they experience in their day-to-day lives is the product of those back to basics libertarian talking points, tax, regulation, planning, etc. So we're focusing on those wedge issues. We've got 6 next generation fellows, with a second round of fellows to come probably at the beginning of next year. These are young people actively engaged in policymaking. We're helping them to develop their ideas, to develop as speakers, as writers, as researchers, and to take that kind of torch of classical liberalism forward into the next generation. So those are a couple of our practical efforts to incubate these ideas amongst younger people.
Oh, excellent. Well, we look forward to seeing those fellows out there in due course, and we may even get one or two of them along to speak to us at some point.
Yeah, that sounds fabulous. That's a really, really good idea.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Sam. Mike, what have we had on our website recently?
Yeah, well, so if you enjoyed listening to Sam there, then we've got a couple of articles from him. One initially about Dubai, as mentioned, which is about its transformation from a port to a mega city and a big business environment. Much less to do with oil than you might expect. Worth having a read, a really bit of interesting history and economics tied in there. On a slightly different note, and again, Sam alluded to it there about law and order, we've also got an article from Sam about private security and the law enforcement gap, and how as the police rescind in some of their role, how private security is picking that up, and the consequences of some of the changes that are happening. Just a quick stat on that. In 2022, 89.2% of bike theft cases across England were unsolved, and that's 93% in London. And as anyone knows that's bought a bike, they are expensive pieces of equipment. And yeah, well worth having a read of that. On a slightly separate note, closer to home, I've written an article on could there be a worse idea for Croydon? Talking about Croydon Council's review of an idea to start taxing businesses in Croydon for having private car parking spaces for employees. Our town centre is run down enough. We don't need to drive business out of it, is my view. Also tied onto that article is a talk about the Borough of Culture and the huge amounts of money the borough has spent on being the Borough of Culture last year. Now, bear in mind, just as a reminder for those of us that don't already know through our council tax bills, Croydon is a de facto bankrupt. My article looks at the 428,000 of redacted payments that went somewhere, the 266,000 that went to the Stanley Arts Centre for Borough of Croydon, being the Borough of Culture, and many, many other things. So yeah, might pique your interest at where your council tax money is going.
Excellent. Well, Mike, we've also had a recent event, and we've got a couple of really good upcoming events. Indeed.
So thanks for those that came along. We had a really good event in August. Asking general election 2024, how was it for you? We had a representative from the SDP and one from Reform talking about candidates, how it was, how what being a candidate's like, what they got up to, and their thoughts for the future. So good event, and it's on our last podcast. So if you listen to this and want to go back to listen to that, please do. A couple of upcoming events. We're working with the Freedom Association. They have a campaign day on the 7th of September in Epsom. So if you want to come along on the 7th of September, we're meeting outside the assembly rooms, the pub, at 10:30 a.m. in Epsom. And we'll be handing out leaflets for the Freedom Association talking about their campaign for promoting liberty. And yeah, be a great day out, and hopefully a sunny day, an opportunity to push the cause. Further to that then, on the 18th of September, we're back in Purley for our regular monthly event. We have a conversation with Joanna Marchong of the Taxpayers Alliance in Whispers in Purley. 7 p.m. onwards, come along, listen to Joanna, hear what the Taxpayers Alliance are doing, what her role is there. We will eventually put it out as a podcast, We'll also have a bit of an open Q&A that you need to be there for. So come along and join us for drinks and chat to Joanna.
Yeah, really looking forward to those upcoming events. Well, if you'd like to write for the website or have any stories you'd like us to cover, do please contact us. You can do so via the Twitter, or X as I believe it's now called, at CroydonConst, via our Facebook page, via our website, croydonconstitutionalists.uk, or via email, contact@croydonconstitutionalists.uk. Well, do please subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel. Do please like, share, and leave a review. It's always good to get feedback, and it helps others to find the podcast. Well, thank you very much to Sam for joining us today. It's been excellent talking with you.
Thanks very much, guys.
And thank you to everybody for listening. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Stay free, everybody.